All right, so ready to really get into it with this deep dive, looking at some really interesting analysis about the relationship between the U.S., Russia, and China.
Yeah. You know what strikes me right off the bat is how differently the conflict seems to be understood here in the U.S. compared to what we're seeing play out on the ground.
Yeah, it's almost like we're looking at two completely different pictures, right? On one hand, you've got these bold claims being thrown around about Russia's losses, their economy, even Putin's grip on power. But then you've got experts saying, whoa, 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 not so fast.
Exactly. And that raises some big questions about where this information's coming from, whether there's some wishful thinking mixed in.
Right. Like, is it just different perspectives or is it deeper than that?
Well, part of it is about different experiences, too.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about a level of intensity in this conflict that the U.S. military hasn't really dealt with for decades. You know, large-scale ground combat, heavy artillery, the kind of fighting that Russia's been training and preparing for.
That's a pretty sobering thought. Makes you wonder if we're really grasping the reality of what's happening over there.
Yeah, it does. And it makes it even more important to look closely at some of the specific claims being made. Like you mentioned, Russia's losses. There's been this assertion that they've suffered 1 million casualties.
1 million. That's just an astronomical number.
Right. And experts are pushing back hard on that figure.
So how are they challenging it?
Well, they're looking at all sorts of data, open source intelligence, battlefield footage, even patterns in how Russia reports its own casualties. And when you analyze all that, the estimate comes out much lower, more like 150,000.
Still a huge loss of life, obviously.
Yeah.
But a far cry from 1 million. It's like we're getting two completely different stories about the conflict.
Yeah, and it's not just casualties either. There's also this idea that Russia's economy is on the verge of collapsing because of the sanctions.
Right, but the experts are saying it's not that straightforward.
Nope, not at all. While sanctions are definitely having an impact, the analysis suggests that Russia's been adapting, finding ways to get around them, and even finding new markets for their exports. They're proving to be much more resilient than some might have expected.
Which brings us to this whole idea of economic warfare targeting Russia's oil revenue.
Right. The idea being to drive down oil prices to a point where it really hurts Russia's economy.
The target being $45 a barrel.
Yeah, but there's a lot of skepticism about whether that's even possible or if it would actually work.
And some are even saying it could backfire on the U.S.
Exactly. And it all comes down to production costs. You see, Russia can produce oil at a much lower cost than the U.S., meaning they can still make a profit even with lower prices.
So the U.S. would end up hurting itself more than Russia.
Well, that's the worry.
Yeah.
Especially if oil prices plummeted, it would be the U.S. oil industry that feels the pinch first and hardest.
High stakes game, right.
Definitely a risky move, and one that experts are urging policymakers to think long and hard about before they go down that path.
We also can't forget the symbolic importance of May 9th in Russia, right? Yeah. Their victory day. It's like a deeply ingrained part of their culture and history.
Totally woven into their national identity, and yet there's this idea floating around of trying to push for a peace deal on that very day.
Oh, man. Talk about a major misstep. That would be like us trying to schedule a big negotiation on July 4th. It's just not going to fly.
Exactly. It just shows a lack of understanding of the cultural and historical context.
Yeah, you really have to wonder if we're truly grasping the reality of the situation over there.
Right. And that seems to be the bigger issue here. A lack of strategic thinking, a disconnect from what's actually happening on the ground.
Like we need to step back, get a clear picture, acknowledge the dynamics at play, instead of operating based on old assumptions.
Precisely a more realistic approach, one that recognizes the limits of our power and the need for a much more nuanced strategy.
So less about trying to force things and more about understanding how to actually engage.
Exactly. And that includes building a European security framework that acknowledges Russia's position and actually addresses the underlying issues that got us here in the first place.
Right. A framework for the future, but one that's actually built on a solid understanding of the present.
That's it. We can't keep repeating the mistakes of the past. We need a new approach, one that's grounded in reality and focused on creating a more stable and secure future for everyone.
And of course, we can't ignore the increasingly tight relationship between China and Russia. That recent phone call between their leaders really underscored that alliance.
Oh, yeah, they're definitely on the same page about moving towards a multipolar world.
Right, one where the West doesn't hold all the cards, but the power is distributed more evenly.
Right, and that shift has huge implications for the U.S. and its allies.
You have to wonder if we're taking it seriously enough, though.
Well, that's the frustration that's coming through in some of this analysis, the sense that some U.S. politicians are underestimating both Russia's capabilities and the strength of this alliance.
Like we're missing opportunities for real dialogue and diplomacy.
Exactly, and there's a worry that we're clinging to old strategies that just don't apply anymore.
So we've got these wildly different views of the conflict, different assessments of Russia's strength and resilience, this proposed oil strategy that seems pretty questionable, plus this growing concern about the U.S.'s ability to navigate this whole situation.
It's a lot to digest for sure, but I think the takeaway here is the sense of urgency, like the alarm bells are ringing.
Like, we need a course correction and fast.
Exactly. We need a more informed, more strategic, and definitely more realistic approach to foreign policy, or we risk sleepwalking into a future that none of us want.
So before we jump into the next part of our deep dive, I want to hear what's standing out to you. What are your initial thoughts on this oil strategy? What kind of European security framework do you think could actually work in this current climate?
And it's worth pointing out that some of this analysis doesn't pull any punches when it comes to criticizing U.S. political figures.
Oh, really? So who are they calling out?
Well, there's this real sense of frustration, even anger at what they see as a lack of competence and understanding, particularly when it comes to dealing with Russia and China.
So who's getting the most heat?
One figure in particular is singled out for some pretty harsh words. They're basically saying that this individual is out of touch with reality, making decisions based on bluster and ego instead of actually thinking strategically.
Wow, that's pretty rough. What about the people advising this person?
Yeah, they don't get off easy either. One advisor in particular is labeled as someone who just doesn't get how the world works. Like, they don't understand the global economy or the complexities of international relations.
So the concern is that the advice being given is not just bad, but actually dangerous.
Exactly. And the worry is that this whole inner circle is operating within this bubble of American exceptionalism.
Like, they can't see the world as it is.
Right. They're stuck in this Cold War mindset, unable to adapt to the reality of a multipolar world.
And the consequences of that disconnect could be pretty serious.
Definitely, they're saying the U.S. could end up sleepwalking into conflicts all over the place.
Because we're misreading the situation and miscalculating the risk.
Exactly. Like, we're overplaying our hand, pushing too hard, and risking a backlash that could really hurt our interests.
That's a scary thought. There seems to be this real sense of urgency in the analysis, like we need to change course.
Yeah. And there's also this irony that while the U.S. is trying to project strength and dominance, our actions are actually coming across as erratic and unpredictable.
So instead of asserting control, we're creating more chaos.
Right. And that goes back to the need for a more strategic and nuanced approach, one that's based on a realistic assessment of the world and a clear understanding of the risks involved.
So less about throwing our weight around and more about actually engaging with the rest of the world.
Exactly. And that means moving away from simplistic solutions and really embracing the complexities of the global stage.
So this criticism, it's not coming from a place of hostility towards the U.S., is it?
No, not at all. It's important to remember that these are people who are deeply invested in the well-being of the U.S. They're worried about where we're headed and believe that we need to change course.
Like a wake-up call.
Right. Like, hey, America, the world has changed and we need to adapt if we want to maintain our influence.
And part of that adaptation means recognizing that we can't just dictate terms anymore.
Exactly. We need to build relationships, find common groundwork together to solve problems.
So less about going it alone and more about cooperation and diplomacy.
Right. And that means listening to other countries, understanding their perspectives, especially those who see the world differently than we do.
Especially when it comes to something as complex as the conflict in Ukraine.
Exactly. There are so many different perspectives and narratives at play, and we need to understand all of them if we want to find a path to a peaceful resolution.
So we've talked about criticisms of U.S. foreign policy, the need for a new approach, the importance of diplomacy and cooperation. But what about public opinion? How do everyday Americans view these complex international issues?
That's a great question, and it leads us perfectly into the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore how public opinion, the media, and foreign policy all intersect.
Yeah, public opinion, it's this huge force, right?
Yeah.
Can either push foreign policy forward or hold it back.
Yeah.
But how much does it actually matter?
Oh, it matters a lot, but it's not a simple, cause and effect thing. It's
Right.
more of a back and forth between policymakers and the public, both sides trying to influence each other.
It's like policymakers are trying to shape public opinion, but they also have to respond to it.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the media's role in all of this. They're the ones who are filtering and explaining these complex global events to the public, so they really shape how people understand things.
It's like a big game of telephone, right?
Yeah.
Where the message changes a little bit each time it's passed on.
Exactly. And the way a story is framed can totally change how people see an issue.
Like if the media really focuses on the human cost of a conflict,
Yeah.
it might push people to support humanitarian aid or even intervention. But if they downplay those aspects, then it creates a completely different picture.
It definitely limits the options that people are even willing to consider.
So the media has a lot of power to set the agenda and shape the narrative. It's like they're setting the stage for a playwright.
Yeah.
And how they set things up influences how the audience experiences the story.
And just like with the play, there are always multiple interpretations and perspectives on any given event.
So how do we make sense of it all? How do we make sure that foreign policy is based on facts and not just knee-jerk reactions or oversimplifications?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
I think it starts with media literacy, being able to really critically evaluate the information we're consuming and recognize when there might be bias or an agenda at play.
So don't just take everything at face value.
Right. Ask questions like, who's telling this story? What are their motivations? What's missing from this picture?
And be aware of our own biases, too.
Right. Absolutely. We all have preconceived notions, and it's important to be open to hearing different perspectives, even the ones that make us uncomfortable.
Because ultimately, good foreign policy requires a nuanced understanding of the world.
Yes.
One that goes beyond the easy answers and the simple narratives.
It's about embracing complexity, recognizing how everything's connected, and being willing to have real conversations, even with people we disagree with.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from military realities to economic strategies, political perceptions, the role of the media, public opinion, a lot.
And these aren't just abstract ideas, right? They have real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. And it's a lot to think about. But hopefully this deep dive has given you some new perspectives to consider. You know, we've seen how perceptions can be distorted, how narratives can be manipulated, and how important it is to think critically and ask questions.
It's not about having all the answers. It's about seeking understanding, engaging in real dialogue, and that's the first step towards navigating this complex and ever-changing world.
Yeah, absolutely. So keep those conversations going. And remember, even when things feel uncertain and messy, the pursuit of knowledge and understanding is always worth it. Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.